Nietzsche certainly contributed heavily to the general understanding of him as a destroyer, as an immoralist, as an antichrist. He claims himself to be an immoralist, and I think this is, perhaps more than anything else, one of the reasons why he is so often attacked in philosophy and outside of philosophy as a danger. The truth is that Nietzsche was generous, kind, courteous, trustworthy, a good friend, and my guess is he probably never did an immoral thing in his life. So one is tempted to ask, was he so out of sync with himself that the philosophy on the one hand praises and defends immorality, while he himself was a perfectly moral, good citizen? And I think the answer is no. That's not what's going on here. It's not a matter of the philosopher out of sync with his philosophy. Nietzsche, more than anyone, insisted that the philosopher should be an example of his philosophy. But then we have to understand what he means by immorality, and it's not what you immediately would think it to be. I think a good interpretation of this aspect of Nietzsche is to say that what he attacks, first of all, is a particular kind of morality. Not morality across the board, and certainly not ethics and values as such. He attacks Judeo-Christian morality, and even that, I think we should be very careful, not in all aspects. What he dislikes about Judeo-Christian morality is, first of all, its emphasis on the otherworldly, and its detraction from our enjoyment of, our attention to this life. But more deeply, there are a number of notions in Judeo-Christian morality which lend themselves to cruelty and hypocrisy, and it's these that Nietzsche wants to call into question. In particular, there is an interpretation of Judeo-Christian morality which emerges at the beginning of the 19th century, at the end of the 18th, defended by Immanuel Kant and some of his followers. It takes the Judeo-Christian morality to be essentially a kind of rational morality, and it is defined most of all by what Kant calls the categorical imperative, the notion of a general, universal, rational principle which is binding on all rational creatures, in other words, on all human beings. What's wrong with such a morality? Well, just to start, one can ask whether universal principles in any form, whether defended by reason or not, do in fact apply equally to all human beings. One can go cross-cultural and very quickly ask whether, for example, a native of Samoa or India or South Africa or Finland really should be subject to the same kinds of moral strictures that a citizen in bourgeois Germany would be bound by. One can ask, I think, more insightfully, whether in fact principles do apply to everyone equally. Or rather, whether it might be that every universal principle, which is applied without attention to the particularities of the individual, might very well be disadvantageous or hurtful, as opposed to beneficial and good for everyone involved. Take, for example, something I have to do quite often, grading a class of students. And there's a sense in which whatever grading procedure I adopt, what I'm doing is going to be more to the advantage of some students, I hope those who work hard and all that, but more to the advantage of some students than to others. And one problem with Judeo-Christian morality and this idea of universal rational principles is the fact that while it pretends to be taking everyone equally under its umbrella, in fact what it does is it is to the advantage of some, to the disadvantage of others. And we'll see that this is going to be an absolutely central thesis of Nietzsche's attack on morality. Or to put it in a different way, one can think of the Judeo-Christian tradition, now moving to the New Testament, thinking of it in terms of loving thy neighbor and a certain kind of respect. But here too, there's a very real question about whether love so spread out, whether love extended to everyone, including strangers and enemies, really still deserves to be called love at all. Or whether respect, something which we can certainly understand with people whom we are admiring of, whether respect can be stretched so thin as to respect every human being and still have the concept mean anything. Here's the interpretation that I would want to give. First, that what Nietzsche means when he says he's an immoralist is he rejects the rather particular notion of morality, which appears, first of all, in the Old Testament as the Ten Commandments and is updated and defended by Kant as a sequence of rational principles, and that notion of morality as it appears in the New Testament, in which love and respect are stretched so thin that they no longer have anything like the power that they are supposed to have. But here, too, there's a more philosophical interpretation. One might look at it in this way. What Nietzsche is doing is he's rejecting not even so much a kind of morality as opposed to a certain way of looking at morality. And again, let me go back to Kant. The idea is that if morals is defined by rationality, then by its very definition, it must be universal, applicable to all human beings, and quite independent of feelings, culture, individual considerations, and Kant would even say of consequences. On the other hand, one might take the philosophy of utilitarianism, which was also very powerful in the 19th century. John Stuart Mill is roughly a contemporary of Nietzsche. And take that philosophy, the greatest good for the greatest number, that one always ought to act in such a way as to maximize benefits and minimize harms. And think of that as a way of characterizing ethics or morality. And one comes up with the rather obvious conclusion. Mill himself worried at great length about it, about whether in fact such universal principles and the general notion of pleasure or happiness and the supposed commensurability of different kinds of pleasures and different preferences and interests can in fact be used as an adequate notion of morality as such. What Nietzsche wants to say against both the kind of philosophy we get in the Old and New Testaments, and defended by Kant, and the kind of philosophy that we find in people like John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians, is that as much as these might seem to be different, in fact, they're all of a piece. That what they do is they tend to focus, in particular, on particular actions. The idea of whether an action, for the utilitarians, has good or bad consequences. Whether an action, in Kant, is motivated by the right kinds of intentions, or what he calls a good will. Whether an action is motivated, in the New Testament, by love, or whether an action is motivated, as in the Old Testament, by the fear of God and a universal commandment. What he wants to say is that there's an alternative to thinking about things in this way. There's an alternative focus which has been ignored. And in fact, it's a very old philosophy, one that has very strong credentials, but nevertheless has almost disappeared from modern thinking. The way I would put it is it's a philosophy of virtue, a philosophy of character. One thinks, for example, about the ethics elaborated by Aristotle. It is defined not by rules, not by the right thing to do, certainly not by love, fear of God, but rather it is all defined in terms of and motivated by a person having good character, a person having the right kinds of virtues. And one of the interesting features of having the right kinds of virtues is that it escapes from the kind of dilemma which has come down to us as really almost the essence of Christian modern ethics. And that is the kind of split between, put it one way, pleasure on the one hand and duty on the other. Or to put it in a different way, the split between how one conceives of oneself as a righteous person and how one conceives of oneself in terms of self-interest. Or, very simply, the kind of split we find in such modern writers as Ayn Rand between selfishness on the one hand and altruism on the other. Well, what Nietzsche wants to say is this is a false dichotomy. And if you look at this idea of virtue, as it's defended, for example, by Aristotle, and Nietzsche and Aristotle are very close on many of these points, what comes off is not that one makes a choice between one's righteousness or duty and one's own advantage or pleasure. Quite to the contrary. Aristotle tells us that one enjoys being virtuous for its own sake. This is not quite to say that virtue is its own reward. That's a kind of cheap follow-up that suggests that if you do the right thing, you'll be rewarded. That's exactly what Nietzsche and also Aristotle want to get rid of. Rather, the idea is that you are so identified with your virtues. You think of yourself as an honest person, as a person who doesn't lie, as a person who is trustworthy, as a person who is a friend. And consequently, that's what motivates you. Because not to act in your own character, to act out of character, to act against your character, is so debilitating, so offensive, that it's not something you would ever think of doing. When you think about people who are very trustworthy and honest, and you ask them, why don't you lie? They might give you a Kantian answer. Lying is wrong. It's a universal rational principle. Or they might give you an answer of the sort that Mill would give. Lying hurts people's feelings. It makes you untrustworthy in the future and so on. But the virtue person, someone like Aristotle or Nietzsche, would rather say, I don't lie because I'm not a liar. And that's really the end of the matter. So to put it very succinctly, Nietzsche says he's an immoralist, suggesting at least that he defends all kinds of really bad actions. In fact, he doesn't defend virtually any bad actions. What he says instead is that we have to look at morality in a different way. And in particular, I would put Nietzsche side by side with Aristotle, and I would add side by side with the earlier Greeks' notion of ethics, and say what Nietzsche has in mind is a way of thinking about ethics that puts all its focus on the notion of individual character. What kind of a person are you? And of course, I put that in the second person. In fact, for Nietzsche, it should, as in Kierkegaard, almost always be put in the first person. What kind of a person am I? Because one of the things that Nietzsche defends throughout his philosophy, although I would add not always consistently, and certainly not consistently as a person, is the idea that we spend much too much energy judging other people. This itself is a sign of a certain kind of nihilism, a certain kind of decadence, a certain kind of immorality. And for Nietzsche, the idea of judging other people is already something gone wrong. The person you judge is yourself, and you judge yourself in terms of whether or not you are and have lived up to the character that you can be and want to be. In terms of this idea of looking at morality in a different way, Nietzsche gives one of his most dramatic accounts, in this case of the history, and he would say the genealogy of morality. It goes back to the notion of perspectivism that I discussed in the last lecture, the idea that one always sees a phenomenon, a thing, sees the world from one perspective or another. And I mentioned that there are aesthetic perspectives, scientific perspectives, religious perspectives, moral perspectives, and Nietzsche plays these off against each other. One thing to say is that Nietzsche, playing off the perspective of the aesthetic view and the perspective of the ethical view, almost always comes down on the side of the aesthetic view. So just as he said the ancient Greeks were so beautiful because they accepted their position and lot in life and made something of it, one might say that Nietzsche, in the realm of morality, finds virtuous people beautiful, not so much good, or even in a sense, morally good, a term which he uses very reservedly. But rather the idea is that we see them as beautiful. And in ethics, as in aesthetics, the idea is to be beautiful. In line with his perspectivism, Nietzsche also suggests that there are perspectives within the realm of ethics, within the realm of morality. Now, this is not something we normally think of. I used the phrase in the last lecture, the moral point of view, suggesting that there is just one, that there is a way to view the world morally. And of course, the very word morality suggests that it is in some sense one thing, one set of principles. Take the Ten Commandments. Or Kant, when he's talking about morality, talks about the categorical imperative, but notice he talks about the categorical imperative, as if there's just one of them. And even when Kant goes on to give an elaboration of different, as he puts it, formulations of the categorical imperative, the idea is that still, morality is something singular and unified. Nietzsche, by contrast, distinguishes between what he calls master morality and what he calls slave morality. His history, or genealogy, tries to trace back these different notions and the concepts of good and evil and good and bad, which, as you'll see, are quite different, through history with an attempt to understand how we came to use these terms in the ways that we now do. On the one hand, it's straightforwardly a historical investigation. What he's trying to do is he's trying to find the sources of our moral prejudices. At the same time, it is genealogy, or rather I think we would say etymology, in the sense that he's really interested in the language and how the language emerges and what terms are related to what terms through history, and how we come up, again, with the understanding of morality that we now have as a singular, unified set of principles. Well, let's begin by talking about master morality. Master morality is easy enough to find in the ancient world. One finds it most notably in ancient Greece, and of course in Greece's subsequent culture in Rome. One finds it throughout the Middle East and throughout the Mediterranean in ancient times, and one thinks of virtually all of the great societies of the ancient world, in Sumeria, in Assyria, in Babylon, and of course in Israel, because we should not forget that Israel was at one point a great state in the Middle East, and we'll go back and talk about that in a number of different ways. But most notably, of course, Nietzsche is concerned with the Greeks, whom he adored. And when he talks about the Greeks, again, while I think Aristotle is an example of what he's talking about, a much better example in his own mind would be the Greeks of Homer's epics. And here, as often, Nietzsche talks in a rather severe warrior mentality, often exaggerates the case. In fact, the book in which he most thoroughly discusses this, called The Genealogy of Morals, he subtitles it A Polemic. And we should make no mistake that Nietzsche is trying to shock us, and in particular trying to shock us into seeing morality in a different way. Well, what is master morality? When you think about the masters of ancient Greece, and of course we're talking about a very small class of aristocrats and rulers, and they are supported by an enormous number, perhaps in the millions, of slaves, captives, and other people, craftsmen, soldiers, who are not aristocrats. The structure of society in the ancient world is for the most part a triangle with a very small number of very privileged, powerful people at the top and an enormous number of people who are not so well off at the bottom, many of whom, most of whom, are slaves, whose life consists of essentially supporting and making possible the life of the Greek aristocrat. Aristotle, for example, had no tolerance for work. He never worked, I think, a day in his life. He acted as a tutor, but he didn't think, of course, as philosophizing and teaching as work, for Alexander the Great. But when he goes to talk about commercial society and talking about merchants, when he talks about the peasantry, when he talks about the kind of work that people do with their hands, you can sort of feel the disdain. It's the presence of such people, however, that make his life as a philosopher, full-time, possible. It's those people who make possible the pursuit of the kind of excellence that the masters generally admired. And that, of course, is where the focus of master morality lies, precisely in that notion of excellence. Aristotle uses a word which can be translated either as virtue or as excellence. And one might think those are two completely different notions. because the idea of virtue is a moral notion, whereas the idea of excellence, well, that's kind of practical, prudential. I mean, you can be excellent at archery or excellent at pot building. That has nothing to do with morality. Whereas if we're talking about virtue, well, isn't that, things like honesty and trustworthiness and things that really fit into a very special conception, a moral conception of ourselves. But of course, precisely what's important here is the fact that these two things are not opposed. That what we're doing when we pursue morality, broadly construed, master morality, is what we're pursuing is our own excellence, and virtues are excellences. So when Aristotle goes on to list the virtues, we might be surprised to find not only just such things as honesty and trustworthiness, but also something like wittiness, being a good friend. In short, being congenial, being the sort of person who gets along with others. The idea is that in pursuit of being a really good person, a beautiful person, everything gets taken into account. And there is no reason to privilege some particular virtues or traits over others, not in general, that it really takes the whole package, what Aristotle refers to as the unity of the virtues, the idea that a really good, admirable person is going to have not just one virtue, but all of them in proper proportion. Now Nietzsche, as I said, rejects Aristotle, at least in this sense. He sees Aristotle and his two illustrious predecessors, Socrates and Plato, as already belonging to a period in Greece, which is, in his words, decadent. It's already on the downward slide. Now, some of this reflects Nietzsche's rather anti-democratic thinking. In fact, this is a period of Greek democracy, and interestingly enough, Socrates here is on Nietzsche's side. Socrates also was an opponent of widespread democracy. But the idea was that Greece, in its glory, was the period before, and consequently the conception of the virtues and the conception of excellence that Nietzsche really admires, again, can be found much more in Homer and the early tragedians than it can be found in Aristotle and his contemporaries. The idea here is, I think, unmistakable. It's, on the one hand, a kind of celebration of warrior virtues. But as always with Nietzsche, it's warrior virtues understood metaphorically. So Nietzsche often talks about his own writing and the courage it takes to write, the courage it takes to express your opinion, the courage it takes to examine yourself and to overcome yourself in very warrior-like terms. But notice, none of this has anything to do with killing people. Nietzsche's own very short stint in the military was, for the most part, in a non-military role. The truth is that what it amounts to is a kind of celebration of a certain kind of pursuit of excellence, which Nietzsche wants to claim has much disappeared from the moral scene, and that's illustrated by the fact that we tend to distinguish, on the one hand, the moral virtues, and on the other hand, what we simply call excellence, or some kind of accomplishment. But let's turn to slave morality, because that's where the heart of the argument lies. To be very blunt about it, what Nietzsche calls slave morality is what we simply call morality. That morality has, in effect, eclipsed master morality, and the big question for Nietzsche is, how has that happened? Slave morality gets traced, as does master morality, back to the ancient world. And in searching for the source of slave morality, Nietzsche points out that the people who originated this morality were literally slaves. He's thinking, for example, about the ancient Hebrews. And here it's important not to think of the ancient state of Israel, which, as I said, was one of the great states of the ancient world, but rather the Hebrews in the time of exile and their enslavement in Egypt. One can imagine, for example, one brilliant Hebrew slave thinking to himself, why do we always have to be the inferiors in this social arrangement? Or, in terms of its logic, slave morality is, as Nietzsche puts it, a reactive morality. It is an attempt to reject, to turn upside down, the excellence morality pursued by the masters. It takes the following form. For example, the masters think that wealth is a wonderful thing. But then in the New Testament we read, it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. Suddenly wealth, rather than being a virtue and a benefit, is a real liability. One looks at the masters with very often their superlative educations. And although this is a later phrase, one comes away with the idea that ignorance is better. Ignorance is even bliss. One sees the warriors of the aristocratic class with all their power and fighting ability. But the New Testament tells us, the meek shall inherit the earth. What's going on here? Well, one can put it in a very systematic way. Now, whereas master morality pursues excellence, in a way pursues one's own conception of what it is to be a great person, what it is to be admirable. And it's not so much comparative as it is, here's what I can be. In slave morality, to the contrary, it is reactive. The slaves see the masters and they envy them. They feel inferior to them. And consequently, they come to resent them. And insofar as resentment is a very clever emotion, what the slaves at some brilliant point in history learned to do is to turn the master's values upside down. So what the masters would call good, the slaves now refer to as evil. So wealth, power, education, even freedom is something which is no longer viewed as particularly desirable, but rather something to be avoided. And on the other side of it, the masters make a distinction between good and bad. Bad means failure. It means pathetic. So on the one hand, if a master fails to achieve what he sets out to achieve, that's bad. And of course, he looks down, the metaphor is significant, at all these people who are not even in a position to try to achieve the things the master aspires to, and he sees them as bad, meaning pathetic. It's interesting to note that Aristotle doesn't even allow for the possibility of slaves and other non-aristocrats to be happy. They might be good slaves, or they might even be, in some sense, good people. But nevertheless, they can't achieve the kind of happiness, fulfillment, excellence that the masters insist upon. On the other side, if the slaves emphasize evil as the primary category, they have a notion of good which is, in many ways, dependent on the notion of evil. Because if what is evil is what the masters consider good, and if these are things to be avoided because they make you, in some sense, a worse person, then to be good is in fact to have less of these things, or best, none of these things. The ultimate result of this is a kind of self-denial. So, at its extreme, what we get is the phenomenon of asceticism, which Nietzsche talks about at some length. People who utterly deny themselves. Now, I think we underestimate to what extent this is still part of our ethic. And I'm not here talking about extreme Christian or other religious sects that, for example, refuse to eat anything just above subsistence. But rather, I'm thinking, for example, of many of us who go on diets, who have various kinds of food restrictions and so on, beyond the point of medical health, or in some cases, for example, vegetarians, moral righteousness, but rather to the point of quite conscientious self-denial. Because the truth is that from this tradition, what we learn is that the good is self-denial, that denying oneself is, quite apart from its medical or even ethical benefits, a good thing in itself. So now we have two warring conceptions of morality. On the one hand, we have master morality with its emphasis on excellence. We have slave morality with its emphasis on self-denial. What happens? Well, a theology makes the difference. The masters are convinced by roughly the 3rd century of the new millennium that being a slave, being self-denying, is ultimately much more beneficial in terms of one's prospects for heavens and so on. But curiously, after 2,000 years of slave morality, master morality has not been erased. It's only been sublimated. Nietzsche points out the phenomenon of what he calls bad conscience, which is in naturally strong and powerful people, this kind of war within themselves as they try to restrict their desire and restrict their sense of what they themselves can be. What you get is a curious battle of pride and humility, of excellence and mediocrity. One thinks, for example, of the medieval popes, enormously powerful men, who at the same time were obviously obliged to the Christian sensibility and Judeo-Christian morality, slave morality, in such a way that they could not, on the one hand, simply admit, as an ancient Greek would have done, that he or she was better than anyone else or better than those around him, but rather there's a kind of humility here, which is forced, artificial, and yet the notion of master morality continues. But with 2,000 years of slave morality, that's given us the self-discipline that comes from self-denial, which is going to allow for the spiritualization of morality. And what Nietzsche is really after, quite the contrary of an immoral, anti-Christian position, is really a new conception of spirituality, something that has not the liabilities and disadvantages and hypocrisies of the old tradition, but something very new, something which we'll see later manifested in what he calls the Übermensch.